The call came in while I was trapped in a glass conference room, half listening to a quarterly compliance presentation that could have doubled as a sleep aid. The kind of meeting where everyone nods at the right moments, pretends to take notes, and silently prays someone important has another appointment so it ends early. My phone buzzed once, then twice. Twice is my daughter's signal. Never 3 times. Never once. Always 2 when it matters. I excused myself with a tight smile and stepped into the hallway before answering. The second I heard her voice, something inside me shifted. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frantic. She was calm, too calm. The kind of calm people use when they've already assessed a danger and decided panic is inefficient. "Mom," she said evenly, "there's a man standing in front of the house. He's pointing a gun at me." No shaking, no screaming, just a statement. My hand tightened around the phone, so hard my knuckles went white. My brain stalled for a split second before offering up the most useless sentence imaginable. Okay, stay where you are. Don't move." She almost sounded amused when she answered, "I'm fine, but you might want to head home. If this guy keeps waving the thing around, he's either going to end up on the evening news or in handcuffs." There was a pause. "Oh, and he says he's with the Homeowners Association." That was the moment everything clicked into place. This wasn't random. This wasn't some desperate stranger. This was targeted. This was personal. I walked back into the conference room, didn't bother explaining, grabbed my bag, and left. A few confused faces looked up as I passed, but I didn't care. No pie chart, no budget forecast, no corporate memo in the world outweighs a gun pointed at your child. People always ask later, how does something like that even happen? How does a quiet, manicured neighborhood unravel into something that insane? 2 weeks earlier, I would have asked the same thing. 2 weeks earlier, I believed I'd done everything right. I'm 46, recently divorced, not in the dramatic, plate-throwing, scorched earth way, more the quiet, mutually exhausted kind. 20 years of marriage dissolved into paperwork and polite conversations about who keeps what. No screaming matches, just a slow realization that sometimes 2 people can try their best and still come up short. After decades of juggling a demanding career and a marriage that had run its course, I wanted one thing, a reset, a house that felt like mine, clean lines, trimmed hedges, neighbors who waved from a distance and respected boundaries. That's how I ended up in Briarwood Hills, a postcard-perfect development just outside Cedar Falls. Matching mailboxes, stone entry signs, landscaping so symmetrical it looked digitally rendered. The brochure promised peace, security, and pride of ownership, phrases that, in hindsight, should have made me pause. Anything that advertises peace that aggressively is usually compensating. The realtor mentioned there was an active HOA. Said it casually, the way someone mentions trash pickup days. I didn't think much of it. I dealt with HOAs before, paid the fees, followed the guidelines. End of story. And I'm a consumer rights attorney. I read contracts for a living. I know how to spot nonsense. Or at least I thought I did. On my very first day in the house, surrounded by half-open boxes and bubble wrap, the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was a woman in her early 50s with a tight, rehearsed smile and eyes that flicked over my shoulder like she was checking for witnesses. She clutched a thick binder to her chest. "I'm Ellen Brooks, HOA secretary," she said quickly, pressing the binder into my hands. "Please read this carefully. Violations can escalate quickly." Then she practically hurried back to her car. I remember thinking it was odd, but I chalked it up to social awkwardness. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. That night, curiosity won. I opened the binder. Within 10 minutes, my lawyer instincts were blaring alarms. The rules weren't just strict. They were invasive. No street parking overnight, even for guests. No gatherings larger than 6 people, without written approval. Fines that double with each repeat offense. Mandatory meeting attendance. And then my personal favorite, a clause claiming the HOA could enter private property with 24 hours notice to inspect compliance. Legally absurd. On its face. I actually laughed and muttered to myself, Did someone draft this after binge reading medieval fantasy? But I closed the binder and set it aside. I didn't move here to fight battles. I moved here to breathe. A week later, my daughter came to visit. Claire is 31, sharp, observant, the kind of person who automatically notes exits and sight lines without realizing she's doing it. To neighbors, she's polite and reserved, someone who vaguely works in federal operations. What they don't know, what she never advertises, is that she commands a tactical response unit for a federal agency. People get strange when they hear that. She prefers anonymity. The morning after she arrived, we sat on the porch drinking coffee when our neighbor wandered over. June, late 60s. Curious eyes. She leaned in conspiratorially. "Just so you know," she whispered, "if you hear boots at night, it's probably Rick." "Rick?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. HOA president. Retired law enforcement. Runs this place like it still is precinct. She laughed after she said it. But it wasn't the sound of someone who found it funny. It was a laugh of someone who'd learned not to complain openly. That evening, I parked slightly crooked in my own driveway, not blocking the sidewalk, not touching the street, just imperfect. The next morning, a bright orange notice was slapped across my windshield. $50 fine. Improper parking. Signed, Security Compliance Officer. At breakfast, I waved it around like a joke. "Look at this," I said. Claire didn't laugh. She studied the paper, tilting her head slightly. "Mom," she said calmly, "who issued this?" "The HOA." She tapped the signature. "No, this wasn't issued by the board. This was issued by one person." That was when I sent a polite, professional email to the HOA. I cited state statutes, requested clarification, asked for documentation of enforcement authority. You know, adult behavior. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Richard Hale. The man on the other end introduced himself. HOA president. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, like a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "We maintain standards here," he said. "Perhaps you're not accustomed to that." I responded calmly. "Legally." I explained my concerns. He sighed. "People who challenge the system here," he said slowly, "tend to become uncomfortable." Then he informed me my attendance at the next HOA meeting was mandatory, and hung up. That night, we heard it. A faint hissing sound. Spray paint. Claire, and I moved the window. A heavy-set man wearing a security jacket stood on our lawn, dragging it across the grass in slow, deliberate strokes. A giant red X stretched across the front yard like we'd been condemned. I opened the window and shouted. He didn't rush. He finished the line carefully. Then he turned toward us, tapped the holster at his hip, and said evenly, "Final warning." And then he walked away. I was shaking, not from fear, but from a white-hot surge of anger that made my hands tremble. Claire, on the other hand, didn't look rattled at all. She gave a faint, almost analytical smile, pulled out her phone, snapped several clear photos of the red X carved across my lawn, and slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Interesting choice of escalation," she said calmly. "What does that mean?" I demanded. She glanced toward the street, where the engine of that idling car hummed low and steady in the dark. "People who escalate to intimidation this quickly," she replied, "usually have something to hide." And that was the moment it all snapped into focus. This had nothing to do with parking alignment, nothing to do with lawn symmetry or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about control. Whoever was running this HOA didn't see homeowners as equals. They didn't see neighbors. They saw subjects. And unfortunately for them, they had just decided to flex that authority at the wrong house. Claire stood, locked the door with deliberate calm, and looked at me in a way that told me her mind was already 3 steps ahead. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think we just walked into someone else's long-running scam." Across the street, the same dark car sat with its headlights off, engine idling, watching, waiting, not quite acting, but not leaving either. It felt like a threat that hadn't decided what shape it wanted to take yet. Now, pause the movie for a second. This is where I need to step slightly outside the story and explain the game that was unfolding. Because once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. On paper, homeowners associations are supposed to function like dull, miniature democracies. Rules are proposed. Members vote. Fines are documented. Enforcement is applied evenly. It's bureaucratic and boring. Endless minutes, procedural votes, and arguments about shrub height. Nothing dramatic. But when you see a single individual issuing security violations on his own authority, making vague threats about residents becoming uncomfortable, and sending someone to mark property with spray-painted symbols, that isn't governance. That's theater. Legally speaking, HOAs do not possess criminal enforcement power. They cannot detain anyone. They cannot threaten physical harm. They certainly cannot brandish firearms or imply the use of force. And any clause that claims a right to enter private property without consent, in most states, collapses instantly the moment it's challenged. But here's where psychology enters the equation. Because this wasn't a legal trap, it was a psychological one. The rules didn't have to be airtight. They just had to sound official enough to create confusion, fear, and exhaustion. Enough so that homeowners would second-guess themselves. Enough that they'd pay the fine instead of questioning it. Enough that they'd avoid conflict because resistance felt more stressful than compliance. People like Richard rely on what behavioral experts call authority bleed. A title, a uniform, repetition, the illusion of structure. All of it nudges reasonable, rational adults into obeying something that feels wrong, simply because it looks official. Once a community internalizes that dynamic, the enforcer barely needs to act. The residents start policing themselves. And the moment enforcement becomes selective, emotional, or personal, you're no longer dealing with neutral rules. You're dealing with control. And control, if left unchecked, always escalates. The following night, when we walked into the Briarwood Hills Community Center, the air felt heavy. Not hostile exactly, but tense. The folding chairs were arranged in rows too symmetrical to be casual. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Residents sat stiffly, hands folded in laps, eyes forward like students waiting for a lecture. At the front of the room stood Richard Hale. Tall, gray-haired, posture rigid. He carried himself like a man who once wore a badge and missed the certainty of command. Behind him hovered the same heavy-set man from my lawn, arms crossed, jaw working slowly, cracking his knuckles from time to time like punctuation. Ellen sat off to the side at a small table, stacks of paperwork arranged in perfect columns. Her eyes stayed down. Her shoulders were tight enough to snap. The moment Claire and I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned. You could practically feel the narrative changing in real time. We were the problem now. Richard greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Always good to see new residents bringing fresh energy, he said, his tone polished but edged. For the next 40 minutes, he ran the meeting like a practice performance. Questions about landscaping expenses were brushed aside with vague references to approved vendors. Concerns about rising security fees were deflected with generic talk about community safety. Any inquiry about financial transparency was redirected or buried under procedural jargon. And I watched it happen. I watched grown adults, people who own homes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, shrink back into their chairs. I saw hands lift halfway, then retreat. Eyes drop, shoulders tense. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like silence. When I finally raised my hand, Richard didn't acknowledge it. He glanced over me once, twice, continued speaking. Only when no one else volunteered did he exhale slowly and say my name as if it were something unpleasant. Yes. I stood, keeping my tone even. I'd like clarification, I began, on the legal basis for private property inspections and the fine escalation structure outlined in the HOA binder, specifically under state code. The room went utterly still. I cited statutes. Calmly, methodically, no accusations, just facts. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A flush crept into his face. His jaw tightened. He dismissed my concerns as interpretations, suggested perhaps I should have conducted more thorough research before purchasing property in a community with standards. The words were controlled, but the irritation underneath them was not. It was the kind of public belittling designed to remind everyone exactly who controlled the microphone, and by extension, the room. The message wasn't really for me. It was for the audience. A demonstration. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraping softly against the floor, Ellen hurried past me. She didn't make eye contact. She just pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and kept walking. Outside, beneath the humming streetlight, I unfolded it. They monitor emails, cameras in common areas. Be careful. The words were cramped, rushed. Before I could fully process that warning, the enforcer brushed past me, shoulder-checking me hard enough to be intentional. Ask the Millers why they moved, he muttered. Then he climbed into the same dark car that had been idling outside our house night after night and drove off without another glance. When I got home, the living room lights were already on. Claire was at the dining table. June sat beside her. Across from them was a man I recognized immediately, Michael Torres, the one who had dared to question the HOA budget during the meeting. Claire looked up at me, and there was a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. The last time I'd seen that expression, she'd been preparing for a high-risk federal operation. "Mom," she said evenly, "meet the resistance." Michael turned his laptop toward me. Security footage. Clear. Time-stamped. Undeniable. Richard standing in a parking lot behind the community center, accepting thick envelopes from landscaping contractors. The enforcer walking down the street, placing violation notices, but only on certain homes, skipping others entirely. Selective enforcement. Then the clip that made my stomach drop. Richard standing beside another man, pointing at a neighborhood map spread across a car hood. Several houses circled. Ours marked in red. That was when the narrative shifted completely. This wasn't ego. It was strategy. They were targeting homeowners in a specific contiguous block near a proposed rezoning corridor, harassing them with escalating fines, intimidating them, driving down property values through fear and manufactured instability, then purchasing the homes at reduced prices through shell corporations quietly linked to Richard's family. It was systematic, predatory. June cleared her throat softly. There was something different in her posture now. Less neighbor, more professional. "I used to be an investigative reporter," she admitted. For years, she'd been documenting patterns. Quietly, methodically, 24 families forced out. Every case the same sequence. Violations, pressure, vandalism, fear, sale. Silence. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the city housing office. By noon, our water was shut off. "Emergency maintenance," the enforcer announced loudly from the curb, wearing a smug grin as if he'd just scored a point. Claire watched him with unnerving stillness, like she was committing every detail of his stance to memory. That night, she installed discreet cameras around the house. The following day, she told me Ellen wanted to meet at a coffee shop. That's when I knew the dam was cracking. Ellen arrived pale and visibly shaking. She didn't bother with small talk. She slid a USB drive across the table. $500,000 missing from HOA reserve funds. Fake vendor contracts. Shell corporations. Payments routed through layered accounts tied back to Richard's network. And then she told us why she'd stayed silent for so long. Years earlier, her mother had been targeted the same way. Harassed, fined, pressured, forced to sell a loss to one of Richard's connected companies. Ellen had taken the HOA's secretary position not to support him, but to gather proof. When Claire overlaid Ellen's internal property maps with public ownership records, the pattern sharpened. Entire clusters of homes were already under entities connected to Richard. We were two of the last holdouts they needed to complete the block. And that's when things shifted from hostile to violent. The vandalism intensified. Flower beds ripped apart overnight. Spray paint scrawled across my car. Comply or leave. Then Michael called. His voice was shaking. "He's here. He has a gun." Claire was moving before I could respond. "Call the police," she told me sharply. "Specify an armed standoff. Response priority depends on language." By the time I reached Michael's house, my pulse was hammering in my ears. The enforcer stood on the porch, one hand gripping his holstered gun, shouting about security cameras violating HOA policy. When Claire stepped between them, her voice was steady. She calmly corrected him on the actual covenant language, quoted it from memory. I watched his confidence falter. Bullies rely on confusion, not clarity. When he pulled a gun and fired a shot into the air, time seemed to fracture. In one clean, terrifyingly efficient movement, Claire disarmed him, twisted his wrist, forced him to the ground, her knee planted firmly between his shoulders. Michael, she said calmly, secure the weapon without touching the trigger. Use a cloth. It was controlled, precise, professional. When the police arrived, everything shifted the moment Claire identified herself and presented credentials. Tone changed, posture changed, respect appeared. As the enforcer was cuffed, Richard screeched up in his SUV, shouting about misunderstandings and authority, only to be shut down sharply by an officer whose patience had clearly run out. That should have ended it. But men like Richard don't surrender quietly. Retaliation came swiftly. Stacks of violation notices. More vandalism. Anonymous intimidation. But by then, the illusion had cracked. We organized an off-site meeting at a neutral venue. More than 20 residents showed up. They compared timelines, shared stories, realized they weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. Together, we forced an emergency HOA meeting, one Richard intended to use to expel me from the community. Then something unexpected happened. Ellen stood, calm, clear, unshaking. She announced she possessed documentation of financial fraud and selective enforcement. The room exploded. Residents demanded a vote. June cited bylaws with practiced precision. Richard's composure fractured. He stormed out. The board collapsed under the weight of its own lies. I thought that was victory. Until the night, Richard broke into our home. The front door splintered inward. His voice echoed through the dark hallway. Gun in hand, he offered money first. A quiet payout to walk away. When we refused, the threat surfaced. Claire remained unarmed. Calm. She kept him talking. Asked careful questions. Let his pride unravel him. Every sentence stacking into a confession. Hidden cameras streamed everything live to a federal task force already investigating his broader network. When he finally raised a gun toward me, still convinced he controlled the narrative, Claire moved, disarmed him. Again, this time for good. FBI agents flooded in moments later. Weapons drawn. Command sharp. As they cuffed him, the fury drained from his face. What remained wasn't anger. It was disbelief, like a man realizing the rules he manipulated for years actually applied to him too. A week later, the neighborhood gathered for a barbecue. Sunlight, laughter, transparency committees forming. Emergency elections scheduled. Neighbors introducing themselves without whispering. For the first time, it felt like a community. Months later, I sat in a courtroom as Richard and his enforcer were sentenced. 15 years. 8 years. Restitution ordered. Restitution ordered. Justice delivered not just by prosecutors, but by residents who finally stopped being afraid. As we exited the courthouse, a reporter asked how it felt. I thought about that first phone call, my daughter's steady voice. And I said, it feels like remembering that bullies only win when everyone believes they're untouchable. Beside me, Claire smiled quietly, because sometimes stories don't end with someone moving away in silence. Sometimes they end with the wrong person pulling the wrong gun at exactly the wrong moment.